The Dominion didn't knock, it simply arrived. Without warning, a gunmetal-gray dropship cut across the dusty void above the refueling outpost known as Kuros Dock, its silhouette sharp and cold like a blade plunged into still water. Inside the cramped cockpit of the Last Word, Morgan sat with his boots up on the console, chewing absently on the end of a carbon wire while waiting on a half-decent parts auction feed to load. When the Dominion vessel touched down on his landing pad, he didn't move at first. He watched the telemetry shift, the ship's ID marking it as a diplomatic envoy, and felt his chest tighten. That wasn't right. Diplomats didn't come out here, not to the Rust Belt, not to him. He stood slowly, his hand brushing the grip of the revolver he kept duct-taped beneath the nav panel. This was going to be bad. The airlock hissed with a dry, dragging breath as the Dominion emissary stepped through. He wore obsidian ceremonial armor trimmed with cold luster silver, a helmet under one arm, expression unreadable behind skin that glimmered with faint biocircuitry. Behind him floated a hover sled bearing a long, sleek stasis pod, its corners chipped, the Dominion crest scored and blackened as if someone had tried, half-heartedly, to scrape it off. "Morgan," the emissary said with a sharp incline of his chin, not a greeting, just a confirmation. "You rendered unsanctioned assistance to Dominion officials 6 cycles prior. You saved a High Counselor's transport vessel. We have not forgotten." Morgan folded his arms. "Didn't ask for a medal. You're not getting one." The emissary gestured. The stasis pod rotated mid-air, angling to show the inside. A humanoid woman lay suspended in deep sedation fluid, her limbs twitching in slow, erratic jerks. Her skin was a rich, dusky violet. Biomechanical plating laced her arms and legs, elegant but broken, sparking where neural lines misfired. Her long black hair drifted around her like dark seaweed in amber liquid. "This is Siriel," the emissary said. "Deemed defective. Her service is terminated. Dominion law mandates that failed assets be recycled, but exceptions are made for those who render unusual service." Morgan took a step forward, heart thudding. "You're giving me a person?" "Not a person," the emissary said flatly. "A thing. You may dispose of her, use her, entertain yourself, whatever pleases you." Morgan's jaw locked. "Get that shit off my pad." "She is yours, whether you accept or not," the envoy said. "To abandon her now would simply confirm her status." Morgan looked at the pod again. A thin scar ran down the woman's right temple, too neat to be a battle wound, something surgical, precise. The Dominion had cut her open, reprogrammed something, and then decided she was no longer worth the upkeep. He didn't reply. The emissary gave the faintest hint of a smile, a smug twitch at the corner of his lip, and turned without another word. The shuttle lifted before its ramp had even retracted, its engine wash leaving behind the scorched taste of scorium exhaust. Silence filled the bay, just the low mechanical hum of the Last Word's cooling systems and the soft broken static from the stasis pod's cracked status screen. Morgan stared at the woman inside. He should leave her, sell the tech, salvage the stabilizers. That was what someone smart would do, what he would have done years ago. But he wasn't that man anymore. He hadn't been since Kira died. A memory hit him like cold breath down his spine, the sight of his sister's blood on a docking bay floor, her chest heaving as Dominion patrols walked past her body like she was just another fallen piece of debris. They hadn't seen a person, just a broken thing, and he'd been too late. Morgan swallowed, walked forward, and reached for the emergency override. The gel began to drain. The pod hissed open. Siriel's body dropped gently onto the padded surface. Her breathing was shallow. She didn't stir. The med readouts flickered, unstable feedback from her spinal implants, disordered neural pulses, partial language center damage. Dominion-grade cybernetics, riddled with internal sabotage. She was never meant to recover. He slid his arms under her weight, surprised by how light she was, fragile, but deceptively dense where the machinery had fused with her bones. Her skin was cool, slightly tacky from the cryofluid. The corridors of the Last Word weren't designed for guests, certainly not for passengers dumped in pieces. The ship was old, human-built, with pressure seals that hissed like angry cats, steel floors that held the memory of every scuff and burn, and the ever-present scent of solder, oil, and stale coffee that had soaked into the walls over years of isolation. He set her down in the spare room he used to call the scrap locker, now stripped clean and lined with soft thermoplast insulation. He adjusted the lights, lowering the spectrum to a soft golden hue to avoid overstimulation, She twitched slightly in the low glow, the muscles in her left leg spasming before settling. Morgan crouched beside her, studying her face. Her expression was blank, but not empty. Deep beneath the stillness, there was something clenched, waiting. He removed the Dominion-issued neural relay jack at the base of her skull. It came free too easily, purposefully sabotaged. And then as he was preparing to check her vitals, her lips moved. A single breath. Not quite conscious. Orinth Chi 40. It was a number, a code, a location, then silence. He stared at her scar again. It didn't match the Dominion's usual neural access points. Whatever she'd been through hadn't been standard procedure, not even by their brutal standards. A whisper of unease traced his spine. Morgan stood and took a final scan. As he turned to leave, he paused and tapped the corner of the console, setting a gentle alarm to notify him if she stirred or panicked. He stepped into the corridor, rubbing at the old burn scar on his wrist, the one he got trying to reroute power to his sister's med bay. The Dominion ships had already left by the time he'd made it work. Never again, he muttered under his breath. The door hissed shut behind him. Inside, Serial lay still. The low hum of recycled oxygen filtered through the room. Soft, artificial warmth wrapped her in its slow rhythm. The scent here was different. No bleach, no sterile metal. Just air, real air. Imperfect. Her eyes opened a sliver. Not because she was fully conscious, but because something felt unfamiliar. The absence of pain, the lack of orders, the hum of machinery that didn't scream instructions into her skull. She saw the soft light, the curved ceiling, the worn seams in the metal walls. Not a Dominion holding cell, not a surgical station. And someone had carried her here, covered her. He hadn't strapped her down. She closed her eyes again, but not in fear, more like disbelief. And somewhere deep in a place that hadn't felt real in a long time, a thought stirred. If this is another test, I'm not ready. But maybe this time, she wouldn't be alone. The silence was louder than the engine hum. Inside the low-lit chamber, Morgan had hastily converted into a living space. Serial stirred beneath the thin, woven blanket he draped over her. Her breath came in shallow waves, and her limbs, biomechanical and twitching with misfiring currents, remained stiff and foreign, like someone else's prosthetics had been bolted onto her without asking. She opened her eyes fully this time. The light was dim, but even that hurt. The air felt wrong, warm, dry, not laced with the antiseptic chill of a Dominion medical facility. The walls were matte, irregular, patched together by human hands, not machine precision. No overhead command feed blared instructions into her neural interface. No monitoring drones hovered. The absence of structure was terrifying. She shifted her weight, and pain flared down her left side, muscle and wire disagreeing over ownership. A low grunt escaped her throat. She tried to sit up, failed. Then tried again, gritting her teeth, ignoring the sharp jerk of her shoulder as the joint protested. From beyond the door, footsteps. Slow, steady. She froze. The door hissed open. Morgan stepped in holding a tin cup. He stopped when he saw her awake, like he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. He approached slowly, not cautiously, but deliberately, like someone who knew exactly how easily things could go wrong if he moved too fast. Serial's eyes narrowed. He didn't speak right away, just knelt beside her and offered the cup. "Water," he said. His voice was rough in tone, but not in intent. "Room temperature. I didn't know what you'd tolerate." She didn't take it. "I'm not here to hurt you," he added after a beat. "You probably don't believe that yet, and that's fair. But I want you to get better." Her fingers twitched. "Who are you?" she rasped. "Morgan," he said simply. "Just Morgan." Her eyes scanned his face, cataloging every detail. Human, late 30s, tired around the eyes but alert. There were calluses on his knuckles, faint oil stains on his shirt, a burn scar curling just above his wrist. A mechanic by the look of him, but something quieter in the way he held still, like someone used to waiting, listening. "This is your vessel," she said slowly. "Yeah, the last word," he replied. "Mine since the last salvage war." "Why did you bring me here?" The question sounded clinical, but inside her thoughts surged in unpredictable directions. He exhaled through his nose. "Because they threw you away." Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as if expecting surveillance nodes. Morgan followed her gaze, then looked back down. "There's no one watching. I cut out their broadcast core. You're offline." Offline. That word alone sent a wave of nausea through her, a sickening lightness in her spine. For Sarathi-born soldiers, being offline wasn't peace, it was abandonment, isolation, deletion. "I'm supposed to be erased," she said, more to herself than to him. Morgan tilted his head. "They said you were defective, a gift, like giving someone a broken tool and calling it a reward." She looked down at her hands. The fingertips were scorched, the plating dented. She remembered, barely, surgical lights. Orders shouted through static. A voice, male, deep, cold. Erase sequence incomplete. Decommissioning priority status revoked. Transfer to disposal protocol. A memory like a flash of old war footage surfaced briefly. Her knees in the mud, hands bloody, gunfire slicing past her and the smell of ozone and scorched bone. Then nothing. She flinched. Morgan noticed. "Pain?" "Yes," she whispered. "Where?" She hesitated. "Everywhere." He nodded like he understood more than he should have. Then he placed the water cup on the floor beside her and stood. "I've started repairing your neural interface. It's not pretty and it's not Dominion grade, but it'll hold until I can rewire it properly. You'll probably experience signal drift, muscle lag, memory haze." "I already do." "Yeah, I figured." She studied him carefully. "Why help me?" Morgan's eyes darkened. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because I didn't help someone else, and they died for it." Serial blinked. He turned away, pretending to adjust the dimmer panel on the wall. "I don't want payment," he said over his shoulder. "You don't owe me anything. And if you want me to leave you alone, say the word. But I'm not going to let them decide your story ends here. Not while I'm breathing." A long silence settled between them. She reached out slowly, awkwardly, and touched the edge of the cup. It was heavier than expected. Her wrist trembled as she brought it to her lips, spilling a few drops down her chin. Water, not nutrient gel, not intravenous saline, real water, room temperature, pointless, imperfect, unnecessary, and human. She hated that it made her eyes sting. Morgan stepped out without saying anything else. The door hissed shut. Alone again, Serial leaned back against the padded wall and let the cup rest in her lap. Her fingers curled around it, as if afraid it would vanish if she loosened her grip. Her thoughts flickered wildly, like sparks inside a faulty neural net. Why hadn't he used her? That's what they said he would do. Why didn't he restrain her? Why didn't he interrogate her? Instead, he gave her warmth, silence, time, and water. The very idea that someone would repair her just to keep her alive, without demand, without programming, was almost more painful than her broken body. In the low light, she noticed a small dent in the wall, a perfect fist-sized crater near the corner, not new, probably from Morgan himself, a mark of frustration or grief. It made the ship feel real, not Dominion perfect, but real. She curled into the blanket slowly, joints aching. Somewhere inside her still splintered mind, a quiet voice echoed, not a command, not a protocol, not an override signal. A question. If this isn't punishment, then what is it? No answer came, just warmth, quiet, and the thrum of a ship still flying. And for now that was enough. The air inside the last word carried a particular kind of stillness, one that wrapped itself around silence and softened the edges of metal and memory alike. The ship moved slowly now, drifting through a dark pocket of space where no beacon reached and no patrol dared follow. Outside the hull, the stars hung cold and indifferent. But inside, a moment was building. It began with movement. Morgan looked up from his workbench as the sensor chimed softly. A low-pitched tone meant not to startle but to notify. Motion limited from the rear compartment, the room he'd cleared out for her. He checked the readout. Serial was awake, and she was no longer lying down. He set down the small array of neural filaments he'd been repairing and stood without a word. The bench light dimmed automatically behind him. He didn't rush. There was no emergency here, just a quiet unfolding of something that wasn't his to interfere with. As he approached the room, he paused just outside the open doorway. The lights were low, filtered through amber-tinted panels that mimicked the horizon glow of Earth at dusk. The temperature was warm enough to soothe joint response, but cool enough to keep her from overheating. A careful balance he'd recalibrated twice already since bringing her on board. Inside, Serial was upright on the edge of the cot. Her body was rigid with effort. Violet skin slick with sweat. Breath shallow but steady. Her long black hair hung down in a tangled curtain, obscuring half her face, and her biomechanical legs trembled under the strain of unsupported balance. Her right hand was clenched around the frame of the cot, her left hovering midair, unsure where to land. She hadn't noticed him. He didn't speak, didn't move. She exhaled, quietly bracing herself. Then she stood. It wasn't graceful. One knee locked too early. The other wobbled as microservos sputtered and re-engaged. But she was upright, shaking, breathing, awake. Morgan stayed still as stone in the doorway, letting her have that moment without intrusion. The first step forward was barely a half shuffle, her foot sliding more than lifting. But it was a step. The second came with a grimace and a soft metallic click from her right knee joint. The third forced a full-body tremble that nearly sent her back down. But she reached out and caught the edge of a support strut just in time, knuckles white against the metal. She stood there, frozen, breathing through gritted teeth. The fourth step was cleaner. The fifth. Her hand left the wall, and then her legs buckled. Morgan moved fast, but not fast enough to catch her. She hit the floor on her knees, hands slapping the steel plating for balance. Her head dipped, forehead nearly touching the floor as she panted. "Don't," she said, voice raw. "I wasn't going to," he replied, quiet and calm. He crouched nearby, close but not touching, not crowding her. "I had it," she muttered, trying to straighten her spine. "I was walking." "I know. It wasn't for you. It wasn't supposed to be." Her breathing slowed as she shifted into a seated position on the floor, spine against the wall. Her eyes met his, piercing, gold-flecked and sharp despite the pain etched across her features. "Then why are you here?" "Maybe I wanted to see you win," Morgan said. That earned him the faintest flicker of a smile, or something near it. It disappeared just as quickly, replaced by the familiar hard edge of suspicion. "You people," she murmured. "You see someone stand up once and call it a miracle." "No," he said. "I see someone who was left to die take 5 steps on her own. That's not a miracle. That's you." Her gaze dropped. She was quiet a moment before speaking again. "Everything hurts. I'd be more worried if it didn't." Serial let out a low breath, her muscles slowly loosening from the tension of effort. Her arms were still trembling, her legs spasming intermittently with minor neural feedback, but she'd done it. She'd moved under her own power. Morgan reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, a sleek canister of water. He extended it toward her, resting it on the floor between them. "Hydration helps recalibrate synaptic activity," he said, tone matter-of-fact. "It's not Dominion-grade electrolytes, but it's real." She eyed the canister, then him. After a pause, she reached out with a shaky hand and took it. Her grip was unsteady, but she drank. The water was cool, clean, unfamiliar. It didn't taste like anything she'd known before, not synthetic, not rationed, just water. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked at him again. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. Morgan didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, scarred, stained with oil, knuckles rough from 1,000 repair jobs no one thanked him for. Then he looked back at her. "Because I didn't save someone once," he said softly. "And I won't make the same mistake again." That silence returned, deep and heavy, but not empty. "You don't know who I am," she said. "You don't know what I've done." "Not yet. And if you did, I'd probably still be here." She stared at him like she was trying to find the flaw in his logic, or maybe in him. "I was a weapon," she said quietly. "They made me into something designed to obey, to destroy." "Sounds like they failed." She blinked. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're still fighting to be something else." Serial let the canister roll gently from her fingers onto the floor. Her hands curled into her lap. "I dreamed last night," she said after a while. "For the first time since they locked me in that pod." "What was it?" "A sound. Music. Strings vibrating. It made me feel something. I don't know what." "Human music?" Morgan asked. "I think so. It wasn't loud, just warm." "I've got a guitar in storage," he said. "It's older than this ship. Doesn't sound great anymore. Will you play it?" He gave a small shrug. "I might." "When?" "When I'm drunk, or when the stars go quiet." Serial tilted her head. "You're not like most humans I've encountered." "I'm not like most humans I've encountered either." That finally drew a faint laugh from her. It surprised both of them. "You don't ask many questions," she said. "You'll tell me when you're ready." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. The silence between them settled again, no longer cold, no longer tense, just calm. Eventually, Morgan stood and moved toward the door. Before he left, he paused, glancing back at her. "When you're ready to try again," he said, "I've got some old training harnesses. Might help balance until your neural grid stops misfiring." "Do I look like someone who needs training wheels?" she muttered. He smirked. "Number, you look like someone too proud to ask for help." "Is that a human trait?" "Number, that's just being alive." He left, letting the door hiss shut behind him. Serial sat there alone for a long while. Her legs ached. Her joints buzzed softly like bees under her skin. Her heart, whatever biological part of it remained, beat a slow rhythm she hadn't been aware of in years. Her eyes drifted to the wall, to the faded emblem of the Dominion etched into the corner of the floor panel. She remembered the branding irons, the cold rooms. The words burned into her subconscious. Hold the line. No fear, no pain, no failure. And yet she had failed, had felt, had feared. But now she had taken 5 steps, and none of it had been ordered. She reached down and pressed her palm flat against the floor, feeling the vibration of the ship beneath her skin. Warm, alive, improvised, human. She thought of the guitar, of music, of him. Her voice came as a whisper to the empty room. "If I learn to run, I want to choose where I go." And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would. Cyril awoke to the low hum of diagnostics whispering through her bones. It wasn't real sound, just the subtle ping of biomechanical nerves flickering in half-functioning pathways, registering the dampness of her skin, the tension in her artificial joints, the aching echo in her organic muscles. Her body was a war zone of unfinished repairs and overwritten code. But this morning, for the first time, the pain felt familiar, owned. She sat up slowly, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Movement was still slow, calculated, every shift a negotiation between willpower and malfunction. But she was learning the patterns. Across the room, Morgan sat on a crate, guitar in his lap, quietly tuning the strings. He hadn't noticed she was awake, or if he had, he wasn't reacting. His fingers moved with practiced absent-mindedness, brushing the frets, twisting the pegs, letting the notes find themselves. The sound was soft, raw. It had none of the smooth, sterile resonance of Dominion soundscapes. This was imperfect, slightly flat in places, too sharp in others. But it was alive. She closed her eyes. That was the sound from her dream. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. When she opened her eyes again, Morgan was watching her. "Didn't mean to wake you," he said. "Just needed something that wasn't quiet." "You didn't wake me," she replied, voice hoarse. He offered a faint smile, then shifted slightly, brushing his thumb along a string. "Ever seen one of these before?" "No," she said. "But I remember it." Morgan arched a brow. "Remember?" Cyril nodded slowly. "It was in the dream. This sound. I was younger. Not a soldier yet. There was a hallway, glass walls, blue lights, and someone was playing. Not for a crowd, just playing, for themselves." He paused mid-chord. "Someone from your species?" "No." She looked up at him. "They were human." Morgan blinked. "Where would you have seen a human playing guitar inside a Dominion facility?" She shook her head. "I don't know." He set the instrument aside carefully and stood. "We might be able to find out." "What do you mean?" "I pulled some partial data from your spinal interface yesterday," he said, moving toward the console beside the bed. "There's a scrambled core of encrypted Dominion code buried under your primary synaptic bridge, buried deep, redundant memory loop, probably designed to prevent cognitive recovery." She frowned. So I found a trigger line embedded inside it." He tapped the panel. "You keep repeating a phrase in your sleep. Orinth Chi 40. It's not just a word, it's a file key." Cyriel's stomach turned. She hadn't realized she'd been saying it out loud. Morgan's tone softened. "I can run a decode. Might bring something back online. Or it might kill me. I'd never trigger anything without your permission." She looked at him. His face was steady, calm, not detached. Present. That was rare. "No Dominion tech has ever been unsealed without a neural blowback," she said. "You know that. I've survived worse," he said. "And so have you." Her eyes met his. There was a silence between them, not of tension, but of heavy consideration. Then she nodded. "Do it." Morgan didn't hesitate. He slipped on the interface visor, linked it to the decrypted patch in her system, and began parsing the layers of code. Serial sat upright on the cot, bracing herself, her hands gripping the edge of the mattress as her pulse rose. Then the lights in the room dimmed. A high-pitched ping snapped through the air. She jerked once, just once. Then her eyes flooded with silver. The world tilted. She was no longer in the room. She was standing in a sterile, circular room with white walls and a ceiling that pulsed like it was breathing. A tall Dominion officer stood before her, flanked by medtechs. Her own body was restrained, legs bolted into floor locks, arms trembling from chemical suppression. She could hear her own voice, detached and echoing. Designation: Serial 1A Vanguard Classification. Emotional variance exceeds 12%. Subject is exhibiting signs of non-authorized empathy synthesis. Recommend termination. No, another voice said. One she hadn't expected, a human male. Older. We're transferring her to Orinth Kai, deep cell. Repurpose her. The memory flickered again. Another moment, another space. Serial in a glass tank, cold fluid surrounding her. Outside the tank, humans and Sarathi engineers worked together. Project Orinth Kai, cross-species neural mapping. Her heart slammed into her ribs as the vision ended. Her body was still shaking. She was a prototype, a test subject. And the human in the memory, the one who'd refused her execution, wore the same face as the man in her dream. Guitar, blue light, glass walls. She had known a human before, but why? Morgan steadied her shoulders as she leaned forward, breath ragged. Serial. She looked at him, blinking hard. They didn't erase me because I failed, she said. They erased me because I felt. Because I remembered things I wasn't supposed to. He didn't speak, just watched her. They were trying to graft emotional constructs from humans into Dominion soldiers, to create an elite class of adaptive warriors who could think beyond algorithms. And you succeeded. Yes, her voice trembled, and that made me dangerous. Morgan exhaled, slow and steady. You were a miracle, he said, and they didn't know what to do with that. They did. They tried to kill it. She leaned back, breathing hard. For the first time, Morgan saw her as something more than broken. She was born from two worlds, and punished by both. He stepped away, giving her space. I think someone from your past wanted you to survive, he said. That human. He could have let them erase you. She nodded. He didn't, but I don't know his name. We'll find it, Morgan said. She looked at him. Why? Because you deserve your story back. Her throat tightened again. He didn't touch her, didn't move closer. He just stood there, like a presence she could choose, not one she had to fear. Then she spoke softly. What happened to your sister? Morgan hesitated. Then finally, Kira was 12. Caught in a border skirmish. I rerouted power to her medbay, but the Dominion had overridden the emergency protocols. They wouldn't authorize civilian access. His voice dropped. She died on the table while I was still rewiring the floor. Serial swallowed. You blamed yourself. I still do. They stood there, pain open between them. No one reached to cover it up. After a long pause, she whispered, You can access my data if you want. All of it. I won't stop you. Morgan shook his head. Only if you want me to. Serial looked down at her trembling hands. They weren't weapons now. They were keys. To memory. To identity. To choice. Then let's do it together, she said. No more locked doors. Morgan nodded. And for the first time, neither of them was alone with their pain. The moment came without warning. The last word drifted silently through unregistered space, its hull gliding past ancient debris fields and starless voids that only those running from something dared cross. Morgan had just finished recalibrating the life support buffers when the ship's proximity alarm chirped, low, then sharp. Not a false ping, not static noise, a signal, a Dominion signal. He froze mid-step, eyes fixed on the console. The red pulse on the screen blinked with steady precision, triangulating from the outer edge of the Aris rift. It was faint but clear. They were being scanned. Impossible, he muttered. His fingers flew across the controls. We're off all known lanes. There's no relay here, no trace code, no beacons. But there was the proof, hovering in front of him in raw numbers and Dominion glyphs. A reconnaissance drone had identified his vessel's signature. Not fully locked, but noticed. He cursed under his breath. Then he ran. Down the narrow corridor, past exposed conduit lines and flickering ceiling strips, until he reached the room where Serial was sitting, legs folded, posture upright, her face calm but focused. She was meditating, or at least trying to. When she saw his face, her entire body tensed. "They found us," he said. Her breath caught. "Dominion? A recon drone. Passive scan, but it pinged us. There's a patrol in range, 4, maybe 5 systems out. If they redirect, we're in their corridor within hours." Cyriel was already standing, despite the pain in her knees. "Then we don't wait. We leave the system, now. I'm prepping a jump to a gray zone behind Thalos Edge. It's barely more than asteroid gravel, but..." "No," she said, "we don't run." Morgan blinked. "What?" She walked past him, grabbing a support beam to balance herself, her breath sharp with pain, but her voice steady. "I've been running since the day they reclassified me. I let them tear me open and erase my name. I won't let them chase me into another corner." He stared at her, amazed. "This ship is armed, isn't it?" she asked. "Moderately," Morgan replied. "A few pulse turrets, a kinetic rail under the hull. It's more for discouragement than combat." "Then we discourage them." He hesitated. "Cyriel, I don't think..." "Trust me." Those 2 words hit harder than any directive or plan. They weren't strategy, they were belief. And Morgan couldn't ignore that. He followed her back to the cockpit. Together, they brought up defense protocols, dimmed the ship's lights, and turned the outer hull cold to reduce energy signature bleed. Morgan set up false echoes to trick any Dominion AI into chasing ghosts. Cyriel rerouted power manually, her fingers trembling, her mind sharper than he'd seen it. She worked fast, efficient, like someone who'd done this before, because she had. Not on this ship, but in other lives. An hour passed in silence. Then the Dominion patrol arrived. A sleek black frigate coasted into scanner range, silent and slow like a shark through water. Its belly opened, revealing a fleet of small drones, all fan-shaped and gleaming like surgical instruments. They surrounded the last word in a pattern of calculated intimidation. Morgan's throat tightened, but Cyriel stood tall beside him, eyes fixed on the screen. "Open a channel," she said. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" "Open it." He did. Static bled into the cabin. Then came the familiar bone-deep voice of Dominion protocol. "This is Command Drone Echo 7, vessel identification. The last word. You're operating in unauthorized space. Prepare for boarding." Cyriel stepped forward, pressing the comm control. "This ship is under sovereign protection," she said, her voice cold and clear. "Any boarding action will be considered an act of aggression." Silence. Then, "Identify yourself." She reached up, disconnected the inhibitor node at her neck, and said the words as if unlocking a cell door in her own mind. "Designation: Cyriel 1A Dominion Vanguard Unit. Status: decommissioned without legal termination. My execution order was denied, which means I still have a voice." More silence. Morgan leaned in. "You're bluffing. They'll attack anyway." "Not if their system recognizes me," she whispered. "Their logic protocol is built to avoid intra-command conflict, and I still count somewhere in their broken records." As if summoned by her voice, the lead drone halted. A pause. Then, withdrawal. The drones folded in, retreated, vanished into the belly of the frigate. Then the whole vessel pulled back. No words, no fire, just the silence of reluctant acknowledgement. When the sensors cleared, and the last word was alone again in the void, Morgan finally exhaled. "You just talked down a Dominion patrol," he said, "with your name." "I talked down a machine," she replied, the tension bleeding from her shoulders. "But yes, with what's left of it." She turned to him then. Something had shifted in her face, not just relief, not just pride, but something softer, earnest, vulnerable. "They sent me to die," she said, "and you gave me a place to live." He didn't say anything. Her eyes searched his. The storm behind them was still there, but quieter now. The fear wasn't gone, but it wasn't in control either. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to." "I want to." Her hand reached up, slow and unsure, fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his cheek. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just breathed her in like she was the first real thing in the universe. Cyriel leaned forward, lips parting. A single heartbeat passed, and then she kissed him, not urgently, not desperately, just completely. It was not a kiss of surrender. It was a declaration, a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, Morgan rested his forehead against hers. "You're not broken," he said softly. "No," she agreed. "Just unfinished." He laughed gently. "Aren't we all?" The ship drifted on. Behind them, the Dominion vanished into the dark. Before them stretched the open unknown, and for the first time since either of them could remember, they chose it, together. The signal that shouldn't exist. The first warning didn't come as a sound. It came as a vibration, low and deep like a pressure drop inside the bones, subtle at first, barely perceptible, but enough to make Serial pause mid-step in the corridor and place her hand against the wall, her breathing uneven. The lights dimmed, not a blackout, just a faint flicker. It wasn't system failure. It felt personal. "Morgan," she called softly, her voice echoing slightly in the hallway. He was already on his way, wiping grease from his fingers with an old cloth, eyebrows furrowed. "I felt it too," he said. Some kind of energy shift. She looked up at him, her gold-flecked eyes flickering with static. "I think it came from me." They moved to the cockpit together. Serial walked slowly, each step controlled and deliberate, her bare feet whispering against the floor. She used the wall for balance, still learning, still fighting every inch of her body to obey commands it no longer understood. Morgan dropped into the pilot seat and pulled up diagnostics. His face tightened almost immediately. "You're transmitting," he said. "Something inside your neural interface is pinging Dominion channels." She froze. "I didn't activate anything." "I know. It's not an intentional signal. It's a response. Like something woke up and sent a handshake code." She stared at the screen, watching as red glyphs scrolled past. Her throat went dry. "Orinth Kai, 4-0. That's what I heard in my head." Morgan turned to her. "You heard it?" She nodded. It wasn't memory. It was alive. The code was speaking, like it was waiting for something, and now it thinks it found it. Morgan leaned forward, fingers dancing over the console. "We're not just looking at a random glitch. This is a system-level Dominion protocol, high encryption, and it's marked you as active." Serial gripped the edge of the console for support. "Then they'll come." He nodded slowly. "Yes, but this time, it won't be a patrol." He spent the next hour combing through the signal logs, silent and focused. Serial sat nearby, her posture stiff, every breath shallow. The tension between them wasn't fear, it was clarity. Eventually, Morgan leaned back, eyes fixed on the screen. "This isn't the same as before," he said. "That drone fleet in the outer sector, that was a patrol. They backed off because your Dominion ID flagged as a restricted class prototype. The system couldn't decide what to do with you." Serial frowned. "They treated me like I was still a possible asset." "Exactly," Morgan said. "But this signal you triggered, it set off a completely different response." He turned the display toward her. "Retrieval priority, Orinth Kai activation, unauthorized status, Class Black Containment Breach Command Authority, High Logic Core, Tier 1. Directive, live unit reclamation or full termination." Serial's fingers curled into the fabric of her suit. "They don't think I'm defective anymore. They think I'm unstable." Morgan's voice dropped. "Worse. They think you're contagious." She looked at him sharply. He went on. "If one of their prototypes can wake up on her own, feel, think, disobey, what if others could too?" A silence settled in the room like ash. "That's why they're not sending scouts this time," she whispered. "They're sending executioners." She turned toward the viewport, eyes fixed on the stars beyond. "And they're not coming to control me, they're coming to erase me." Morgan clenched his fists. "Then we erase them first." The console chimed, sharp and immediate. A transmission was incoming. Morgan braced, but the ship didn't shake. No external forces. No weapons fire. Only a red light that bathed the cockpit in warning. The screen flared. A Dominion sigil appeared, glitching, shimmering, crystalline in its structure. Then a voice came through. Not human, not synthetic either. Something in between, stripped of emotion, made of cold authority. Directive 7 Row. Experimental Unit Serial 1A has re-engaged the Orinth Kai protocol without authorization. Signal detected. Neural core, active. Autonomy, elevated beyond acceptable parameters. Serial held her breath. Morgan reached instinctively for her hand. Unit was not scheduled for reactivation. Current behavior violates Dominion containment policy. Reclamation is mandatory. Reintegration or termination, at discretion of High Logic Command. The voice paused. Then a final message delivered with cutting clarity. This broadcast is your only warning. Resistance will void your organic status. The screen went black. Silence returned like a drop in pressure. Serial slowly let out a breath. They just called me property. Morgan's jaw tightened. Number. They called you a tool that got out of the box. He stood and paced the room, tension in every step. They're not just trying to erase your memory. They're trying to prove no one can escape them. She looked at him. Then I have to be the one who proves them wrong. That night, the last word changed course. Serial input the coordinates herself, shaky fingers dancing over the console as she guided them toward the ruins of a relay facility, known only to Dominion Black Archives. Echo Vault Theta, a place where Orinth Kai had once been tested, stored, buried. Morgan stayed silent as she worked. He didn't interrupt when her hands trembled. He didn't offer to help when she paused to steady herself. He knew she didn't need help. She needed control. And for the first time since she'd been born into a vat of cold Dominion metal, she finally had it. When she finished, she leaned back and met his eyes. "I want you to come with me," she said softly. He nodded. "Of course." "No," she said. "Not because you pity me. Not because you feel responsible. I need you there because I need you. And I don't want to do this alone anymore." He didn't answer with words. He crossed the space between them, cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and deep and sure. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "You're not alone," he whispered. "You never were." Later that night, while Morgan calibrated the engines, Cyrielle stood at the observation window alone. Her body ached. Her knees were sore. Her hands shook if she held anything too long. And her breathing still stuttered if she moved too quickly. But she was upright. She was standing. And she was moving forward. Every step might be slow, but it was hers. Behind her, the stars glowed softly. A few days from now, one of them would become a battlefield, not for a war, but for a soul. Her soul. And she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The sky above Echo Vault Theta was broken. What once had been a space station embedded into the crust of a rogue planetoid now jutted like ribs from the asteroid's fractured shell. Twisted metal towers, blackened solar panels, and dead communication dishes pointing in every direction, forever listening for orders that would never come. Morgan brought the last word into a slow descent. Below them, Dominion signal interference pulsed across the radar in uneven waves, ghost data, and decaying code. Cyrielle stood behind him in silence, hands trembling slightly as she watched the approach. Her breath was calm, measured. She didn't look afraid. She looked ready. The docking clamps released with a final hiss, the landing sequence complete. They stood in the airlock together, Morgan adjusting his gauntlet while Serial leaned against the wall, her body still tired, her balance dependent on every muscle staying alert. But she had refused help. Every step was hers. "One last chance to turn back," Morgan said quietly, offering her a look that was half teasing, half hopeful. Serial's golden eyes met his. "There's no turning back," she said, "because forward is the only place I exist now." He nodded, pulling the lever. The doors opened. They entered the facility through a decayed maintenance corridor, the air stale with oxidized metal and old fire damage. The silence was absolute. No systems hummed, no lights flickered. Only the thud of their boots and the faint rasp of Cyriel's breath filled the space. She walked beside him slowly, one hand trailing the wall. Her cybernetic joints clicked softly with every movement. Her legs ached, but she didn't stop. She didn't waver. Morgan held pace beside her, never walking ahead, never rushing her. The central archive room lay buried 3 levels below. They descended through a rusted elevator shaft, using an old ladder, Morgan first, then Cyril, gritting her teeth as she forced her trembling limbs to obey, rung by rung. By the time they reached the archive, her arms were shaking. He reached to steady her, but she shook her head. "I've got this." She took one more breath and stepped forward into the chamber. It was vast, round, echoing, cold. Data columns circled the perimeter like tombstones. At the center stood a single stasis pod, cracked open and long dead. Cyrielle's. She stared at it, lips parting slightly. "This is where they shut me off." "And where you woke back up," Morgan said. But she wasn't listening. She approached the pod, ran her hand along its side, and then turned to the central console. She connected her implant to the panel with a short neural link. Old logs spilled across the screen, fragments of Orinth Kai experiments, Cyrielle, others, names with no faces, data points instead of lives. She stared, breathing slowly. Then, There were 6 of us. Morgan blinked. 6? I thought I was the only one left, she said. But these logs, someone else made it out. A flicker. A location. Redacted. Serial's voice dropped to a whisper. They didn't kill us all. Before she could process the thought, alarms shrieked through the vault. Red lights flashed from all directions. Morgan spun, pulling out his pulse rifle. They're here. Serial disconnected from the terminal. The ceiling opened with a hiss of decompression, and 3 Dominion soldiers dropped into the chamber, tall and silent, black-armored and faceless. Behind them hovered a sleek serpentine drone unit, thin like a whip, but humming with internal plasma. The lead soldier's voice rang through the vault. Serial 1A, you have violated containment. You will submit for reintegration or be terminated. Morgan stepped forward. She's not going anywhere with you. The soldier raised his arm, weapon pulsing. Serial stepped in front of Morgan. She wasn't holding a gun. She wasn't standing straight. She trembled, her knees bent slightly under her weight, one arm hanging lower than the other. Her chest rose and fell unevenly. Her steps were hesitant. But she stood there, defiant, alive. I am not your property, she said softly, and I will never belong to you again. The soldier fired. Morgan shouted, lunging, but Serial raised her hand. The blast curved, redirected in midair. Her implant flared gold. With a sharp breath, she activated her neural field, sending out a short-range shockwave, disrupting enemy targeting systems. One soldier staggered. The drone hissed, charging its cannon. Morgan fired 3 shots, 2 missed. One struck the drone's sensor core, sending it spinning. But another soldier closed in on Serial. She turned too slowly. The enemy grabbed her. Serial gasped as they slammed her to the floor. Morgan screamed her name. She twisted beneath the weight, her legs spasming, and then she whispered something under her breath. Omega, shift, the Dominion override phrase. The soldier froze. For a single beat, the entire vault hummed. And then, one by one, the soldiers collapsed. Their armor sparked, systems frying from inside. Serial lay still for a second, gasping. Morgan ran to her, dropping to his knees, gently cradling her in his arms. Her breathing was shallow. I'm okay, she whispered. Just tired. You did it, he said, voice breaking. She looked up at him. Tears slid down her cheeks, not from pain, from release. I fought back, she whispered. Really fought. I never thought I'd be strong enough. You've been strong since the moment you walked onto my ship, Morgan said, brushing hair from her face. I just finally got to see it like this. She reached up, fingers shaky, and touched his cheek. I love you, she said. Morgan's breath caught. I don't know when it started. I just know that when I'm near you, I feel like I'm not broken. Like maybe everything I thought I lost wasn't gone. It was just waiting for you to find it. He leaned in, forehead touching hers. I love you too, Serial. He kissed her. Long, fierce, real. Her hands clutched his shirt. His arms wrapped around her. The fire between them wasn't born of need. It was born of survival, of trust, of the sacred truth that they had saved each other. When they finally broke apart, her eyes glistened. We're free now, she whispered. He nodded. And we stay that way. 2 months later, the moon had no official name. It was never colonized, never mapped. It appeared in no Dominion star charts and had no strategic value, just a cold rock with shallow gravity, breathable air, and long, quiet seasons. Forgotten by empires. Perfect. Nestled in a sheltered valley between wind-worn cliffs and a low forest of pale, iridescent trees, Morgan had found a place where time seemed to slow. The wind here didn't howl. It sang, softly, like lullabies drifting from the soil itself. Every morning came in with blue-gold skies and a breeze that carried the scent of warm stone and mineral rain. It was, in the purest way, a place to begin again. Their home was small, built mostly by Morgan's hands and Serial's patience. The frame was crafted from salvaged ship parts and local timber, sealed with polymer resin, shaded with fabric canopies stretched across support beams like wings. It was practical, imperfect, beautiful in a quiet, sturdy sort of way. The porch overlooked a glimmering meadow, and every morning, just after sunrise, Serial walked across it. She moved slowly. She still needed the rail Morgan had welded into the side of the walkway. Her leg brace clicked softly with each step. Her balance wasn't perfect. Some mornings, it took her 3 minutes just to cross the 10 meters between their door and the sun-warmed bench beneath the outer tree. But she walked, every day, without fail. She didn't walk to prove anything. She walked because it was hers. There was no audience, no test, no ranking system analyzing her posture or stride time. Only her feet on living ground, her breath in clean air, her body, damaged but hers, moving freely under a sky no one else claimed. And Morgan? He was always waiting, sometimes on the porch, tuning the old guitar, sometimes out near the water's edge, with his sleeves rolled up and a makeshift fishing line coiled around a stick. He never looked worried. He didn't hover. He didn't rush her. He just looked up as she approached, eyes warm, smile soft, and always said the same thing. "You came back to me again." And she always answered, "I never left." They built routines, simple ones, morning tea, an earthy blend from native herbs that smelled of mint and ash. Midday walks through the canyon, slow-paced, with cereal leaning into Morgan's arm as he recounted old Earth stories. Evenings watching storms roll in over the western ridge, lightning dancing across twin moons. She liked the quiet. He liked the way her voice had changed, more laughter, more weight in the things she chose to say. Sometimes when she stood still, her fingers would twitch the way they used to when her cybernetics misfired. But now, when he reached for her hand, she didn't flinch. She didn't expect pain anymore. Sometimes she had nightmares. She still woke up with flashes of cold labs, of restraint clamps, of metallic voices telling her she was nothing but code. Morgan would hold her close and say nothing, because nothing needed to be said. His arms were enough. They never talked about the Dominion after the second week. It wasn't that they forgot. It was that they'd already won. Freedom wasn't fire and war. It was morning light through cloth windows, the sound of feet on warm soil, a name spoken not as a command, but as a promise. One evening, as they sat side by side beneath the stars, Serial turned to him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that people like me, people who were made, not born, do you think we deserve this?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the sky instead, where the stars stretched in rivers of silver. "I think," he said finally, "that you're not what they made. You're what you chose to be." She closed her eyes. "And what is that?" He turned to her and smiled. "You're free, and you're loved." She reached up, tracing his jaw with trembling fingers, and kissed him, slowly, fully, not in fear or hesitation, but in certainty. Then she whispered against his lips, "Then I'll never leave this. I'll never leave you." He kissed her again, and above them the stars turned, not in violence, not in conquest, but in peace. And neither of them would ever again be someone else's design. They had rewritten the code together.